Good afternoon, everyone. We're just getting our speakers seated. Welcome to all of you. We're here talking about the role of agriculture in creating resilient food systems. You can see the title up here. If that's not the session you're looking for, you might need to check the agenda and find your way to the correct room, but we're delighted that you're here. We have an amazing lineup of speakers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dina Esposito. I lead the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. I also happen to be the Deputy Coordinator for Feed the Future. Feed the Future is the U.S. government's global hunger initiative. It's a flagship whole-of-government program that involves 12 different agencies. Its focus is on reducing poverty and hunger, heavily focused on ag-led growth. We are really concerned with the fact that we need to feed a growing population in a sustainable way through intensification as opposed to extensification, and the importance of dealing with climate change and growing more food in a resilient way in a world where the climate is making that increasingly challenging. We also know that resilient agriculture is vital to address poverty and hunger in fragile and rural areas where the ag system is absolutely vital to the livelihoods of the extreme poor. Just a couple of framing remarks for this session, and then I'm going to turn it over to our experts. To begin with, a few top-line comments. The World Bank provides evidence that growth in the ag sector is up to 4 times more effective at reducing extreme poverty than growth in other sectors in the economy. This is especially true in low-income countries, and this is done through 2 channels. First, by increasing income to farmers and those working in agriculture and supporting industries, and second, by making food more affordable. And this has profound effect on the extreme poor, who can spend up to 60% or more of their income on food. We know that agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, mostly through land expansion for agriculture, and yet we also know that healthy soil and rangeland can be excellent carbon sinks, so it's both a problem and a solution opportunity. We know that climate change has a profound impact on agriculture through not only increased severity of drought and flood, but also through the spread of disease and pests not previously experienced by some of our farmers, and this impact will only increase, and agriculture needs to develop methods to adapt to the changing climate. We know that 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, and perversely, we know that about 1/3 of all food is wasted and not consumed. We also recognize that subsistence farming entraps families into intergenerational poverty, generally with high rates of child stunting, but we're hopeful because reducing poverty and increasing resilience are often possible through improved practices and better access to information, diversification, and greater connection to markets. So this session is going to focus on the production side of agriculture and examine a plurality of solutions. You notice that we have an amazing group of panelists here, and they're going to offer a variety of diverse perspectives and solution sets. The speakers are going to talk about a wide range of issues from ag productivity and technology to social ecology to water management and livestock. And we're going to run it in the following ways. We're going to have 3 speakers first present framing remarks, overview, context from their perspectives. We'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. We'll then bring up the next 3 speakers who will speak more specifically to application of this information in their work, and then we'll have Q&A, and then we're going to ask the panelists for some closing, all 6 of them for their closing thoughts. So that's the way we're going to run the session. I'm going to introduce the first 3 speakers so that they can come up in sequence, and then I'll come back and introduce the second round. We're going to start with Dr. Ousmane Badiane, Executive Chairperson of Academia 2063. This is a renowned think tank based in Kigali, Rwanda. He's going to help us frame our discussion and understand the growing demands on agriculture and the food system. We're then going to turn it over to Dr. Laura Pereira, an associate professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University and a researcher at the Stockholm Research Center, who will discuss the importance of social ecology. She's going to raise some key points related to inequity and justice. Our third speaker to round out this first section will be Dr. Tony Gathungu, Global Head of Seeds to Be at Syngenta Foundation. Tony will provide us with some information related to seed production, the importance of agriculture technology, and provide thoughts on scaling. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Usman.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, everybody, those who invited me and those who are joining us here today. I would like to start my presentation about priorities for ag sector growth and resilience. It's going to be a very quick overview, but I think you can see more of this work when you go to our website. 3 points here I would like to address: the role of agriculture in sustaining the ongoing recovery across Africa, agriculture sector performance transformation priorities as we look into the future, seeking to sustain that economic recovery, but while we're doing that, how we can boost community resilience and crisis preparedness. We came from COVID, we hit Ukraine, and we all know how important that all of it is. Just a few numbers to reinforce what Dina was saying about the strong role of agriculture, not just in creating income and improving livelihoods in rural areas, but in driving the entire economy. When you're at an early stage of development, like most of our countries are, the evidence is just one additional percent growth in agriculture, just tweaking it by 1%, would stimulate industry growth by up to 1.3%. 1% additional export growth in agriculture could stimulate industrial growth by up to 1.8%. My mentor, John Mellor, who hired me to join IFPRI many years ago, used to say agriculture is the most selfless sector in the economy because it drives everything else as it goes. It doesn't stop there. Work we did in the 90s in the Sahel showed that every additional dollar of sales that goes into the rural areas creates an additional $2.5 up to that. And these were numbers from Zambia, Burkina Faso, Senegal, and Niger. It's because that $1 is spent on a lot of other things that creates a lot of other jobs. And finally, it's also been shown that a 10% increase in agricultural sector growth will accelerate the rate of poverty reduction by another 7%. So there is a lot currently that agriculture can and should deliver. And the recent history of Africa bears it out. You see how Africa has tripled agricultural value added since, let's say, over the 20s. Highest GDP growth rate, agricultural value-added growth rate than any other region. It is the time when poverty has declined by 30% and continuously. Those are related, no econometrics, but economists will also confirm what I'm just saying. So continuing on agricultural growth is the right course of action for us to sustain the recovery of the last 2 decades, the longest in the history of the continent, but also to intensify and deepen it to carry as many people as possible along the way with us. But we cannot do it as we did in the past. There's really a change across African agricultural value chains. You know, until about 20 years ago, you had very short traditional value chains. Most of it takes place around the rural areas, the production, the transformation, the marketing, most of it. And even if you left the rural areas, it is the same slightly altered product, or at all not altered, with zero alteration, that will leave the rural areas into the urban centers. That's not that anymore. So the demand in the biggest biggest metropolis, smaller towns, even rural towns, is for ready-to-cook and ready-to-eat, better package, and more sanitary product. So the value chains have become longer, and it is with this value chain that we need to work on in the future to develop the agricultural sector. It is so much so that currently 70% of cereals and cassava traded across African countries is made up by processed. We're not talking about your big stuff. We're talking about your traditional cereals and cassava. Within ECOWAS, it's about 77% cross-border trade. So it's really where the demand is. So if you want to make farmers in rural areas really richer, it has to be through access to these markets for processed process goes. So they have to produce better, but we have to process better. Here is the traditional value chain, where the challenge was, how do we get production from the production areas to the village center, to the rural town, to the secondary town, to the urban centers. So we're dealing with all these different things. So that's why the roads, the trade, the marketing policies, also different things, right? So you farmers cooperatives, storage, all of that, so they can move product out of those areas into the big centers. So that's the old policy paradigm. We still need that, but that's not enough anymore. Because if you do that, you're going to get your maize in the big cities, you're going to get your millet in the big cities, you're going to get your cassava in the big cities, but nobody's demanding them. They have to go through the processing sector. And there you have an additional dimension here, which is how do you go from raw product to better package, to pre-process, to raw input, and ready to eat and ready to cook, right? And that is a matter of product sophistication. Traditionally, it was really a geographic distance that separated farmers from the markets. Today, it's the degree of sophistication of the product that separates farmers from the markets. We have to do both as we go. And here it's about the whole policy around film-level capacities, technology and enterprise creation, technology acquisition, access to capital, skills development, technical, managerial, all the important areas as you seek to work with your countries. But also how those firms that are established can grow. So the environment around them, so transport technology, conservation technology, energy supply, digital infrastructure, norms and standard, intellectual property, competition policies, all become important to link the farmers. Still the farmers in our mind, but to link them to the growing demand in these billions of dollars of market that are being created. So that's where we need to go. Second part of my presentation is about how can we be better prepared while we're trying to do that, so that we're not set back every time we have shocks, right? And here we're saying that it shouldn't be acceptable that every shock that happens has large-scale, far-reaching consequences for large swaths of populations. Shouldn't be. Shocks are natural, but the fact that they affect us so massively is not normal. And for that, we have to be better prepared and should focus, while we're still trying to stimulate productivity and accelerate growth, how can we boost our preparedness and our capacity to respond in normal times, not when we have crisis, in normal time. And to do that, we need to do a couple of things. Invest in understanding the patterns and the nature of vulnerability in normal times, and take deliberate action, targeting the drivers of that vulnerability. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. First, we need to know exactly what drives poverty and vulnerability and where. The example I use here, for those who are from the north, every municipality knows where to put the snow truck before the snow falls, because they know exactly where the problems are. And during normal times, they improve the curves, the turnarounds, widen the street, whatever they do, so that snow doesn't become a bigger problem. Here the example is, where are our communities hurting the most? Where is the absorptive capacity to swallow shock is the least? Here it was during COVID. We looked at Malawi. We said, okay, where people are the poorest, where the most malnourished, where they have the least access to services, where they have prevalence of chronic diseases, and whatever else you add, those will be the communities that will be hit the most if the crisis comes. Know where they are. And when you know it is more malnutrition, work on nutrition during normal times. When you know it is access to services that makes them more vulnerable, work on access to services in normal times. When you know it is chronic diseases, work on chronic diseases in normal times so that you boost their resilience and capacity before the crisis hit. Second, you need a catch-all indicator to know that you're making progress while you're acting during crisis. Here, another example. When you go to a doctor's office, no matter what brings you there, indigestions, viral infection, they take your temperature. And they think all the time, is the temperature down, is the temperature down, is the temperature down, because they know it's a signal of how your body is working. So we need something like that. And the micronutrient adequacy tells you how a community is faring. It catches a lot of things, whether it is the environment they are growing, whether it's access to services, poverty, nutrition, it captures all of that. And you can change this in the short run every 6 months or every year while you work. That allows you also to know if you're going to intervene by distributing crops or by subsidizing or distributing incomes, which kind of crops, what kind of income level, what kind of prices, for which community, so you can have the best impact. If you know, for example, that this community is suffering a lot from anemia, and you have to do food distribution. You're not going to do any food, right? You look for food that is iron-rich and things like that. And then you work on improving access to crops that are iron-rich or that have another. So that's how you build resilience during normal times, and that's how you can target when crisis comes so that you can have the best impact. So move on productivity, take into consideration the transformed value chains, and be better prepared for crisis and build our resilience in normal times so that we can get things done. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I want to invite Dr. Pereira up to the podium. Thank you so much, Dr. Usman. Amazing overview.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, because it also really set up this idea of transformation that I think I'm going to be trying to focus on from a more academic social ecological systems perspective. And so I was very excited as an academic that I was allowed to use slides. So just moving on to the next one. Just really hoping that the preparedness in the north around snow doesn't follow sort of Heathrow at peak snow capacity as the pathway. So my presentation is really just going to try to touch on some of this idea of what we mean by resilience and focusing on a food systems perspective to situate the context of agricultural production within this broader systemic perspective. So just bearing in mind, when we talk about resilience, quite often we think about persistence. There's been a lot of talk around adaptation, but as my colleague touched on, transformation is actually a really big question and an important capacity that we really need to think through, particularly when we're looking at food systems. And just to say also that I really have to acknowledge my PhD student, Batalefi Nekotwe, who was really instrumental in putting together these slides. So this is as much a presentation from him as it is from me. So starting from a social ecological systems perspective, this fundamental interconnectedness between sort of the biosphere base, sort of nature, and our social systems, our economic systems that are founded on this. This is a paper that was published in 2017 by Lene Gordon and colleagues who at the Stockholm Resilience Center that looks at 1961 is on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side was the present day, was 2017. And just looking at sort of from a biosphere base, which is the green, how little impact our food systems had in terms of actually transgressing some of our key boundaries around climate change, for example, biogeochemical flows, the amount of nitrogen, etc., that we put into systems. Though we had already started to have some kind of impact around land use change in particular and around biodiversity loss. The middle was around sort of the food system itself, meeting food security requirements around quantity, nutrition, and safety. And the top is actually the health outcomes, right? Looking at the difference between undernourished and overweight proportions that we were seeing globally. You can see sort of now we're sitting in a very transgressed system. So there's no ways that we can talk about our food system if we decouple it from the kind of environmental impacts that it's generating, but also understanding this is fundamentally where our food comes from, is embedded within nature. How we've also sort of started to get some of the food security systems right, but not so much around nutrition, as was also pointed out by my colleague, and how we're shifting away from sort of an undernourished into a more overweight system. So just situating food systems within this idea of what is the safe operating space? What is it that we can actually and should be producing and consuming at the global level? And you'll see that this will talk to ideas of redistribution. So there was a paper that we recently published in Nature Food, which was talking about how resilience thinking can actually offer some transformative pathways to address some key food, what we called food system aching points. And this was moving away from this idea of we need to go local, or no, only global systems can solve. It was moving away from this dichotomy to actually understand that context matters across multiple scales. And this is also where food production can't be divorced from these broader food system aching points. So as I've already mentioned, there's clear interconnected environmental and nutritional decline. as well as an emphasis on food and nutrition insecurity, which was also sort of mentioned, and I'm sure will come up increasingly as we have this discussion. This idea of food system illiteracy, that we've actually become so disconnected from our food system and where it comes from, that we're losing capacities, we're losing the knowledge systems around growing our food. Urbanization is driving a lot of we don't know how to prepare our food anymore. How do we actually take some of our indigenous crops, for example, and actually process them in many contexts? In some contexts, that's still very much a persistent and important capacity that we need to nurture. But then this fourth one that I'm actually going to be focusing on, which is inequity and governance, and sort of how that actually is a fundamental aching point that really needs transformative change. So this is just a figure that can distract you while I continue to talk, which was looking at some of the pathways that we mentioned, which was around this idea that we need to nurture diversity across multiple scales, that we need to manage the connectivity of the system, which is also touched on by my colleague. The key one, which is equitable distribution of power and benefits, which is what I'm going to try and unpack a little bit, and then increase traceability and transparency within the system. And I'm more than happy to talk sort of further through the outcomes from this for anyone who's interested. But I also wanted to situate this within work that the Earth Commission has been doing around this idea of what is a safe operating space, sort of how do we stay within planetary boundaries in terms of sort of biodiversity loss, in terms of climate change impacts, in terms of land degradation, etc., whilst actually achieving safe and just access to energy, water, food, and infrastructure systems. So this is actually all four of those systems because they're fundamentally connected again. Can't separate agriculture from food systems, can't separate food systems from the water, energy, and other sort of interconnected systems that are also embedded within it. And we took data from 2018 and we basically said if we were to take sort of current technology, behaviors, etc., if we were actually to meet the basic needs of everyone on the planet without sort of any fundamental changes, what would that look like in terms of sort of some of these key boundaries? And we would have a 2 to 20% additional impact on the Earth's natural systems of water, land, climate, and nutrients. But interestingly, these impacts, which are sort of caused by addressing the fundamental needs of almost a third of humanity who are sitting below that threshold, actually equaled the impacts caused by the world's 1 to 4%, sort of wealthiest 1 to 4%. 4% was the food system. Energy, water, and infrastructure was actually just the top 1%. So really interesting just to talk about like who's actually driving the biggest impact on our food systems and where some of that change needs to happen. If we're not actually addressing that overconsumption, and by overconsumption, I'm not talking about overweight overconsumption, I'm talking about just actually having the access to capital that can sort of really transcend boundaries, that's actually driving the 4 planets, right, in terms of footprints that we're looking at. There's no ways that we're actually going to be able to meet the needs of the people that really need their needs to be met, whilst actually maintaining our planetary health system. So this calls for not just sort of innovation and transformation. I think this calls also for a radical redistribution. And so my final slide is really about this idea of how do we talk about addressing inequity and power imbalances. And so this idea of Earth system justice has been proposed. I was really excited to see in the socio-ecological systems discussion that they also had this triangle from an equity perspective. I unpacked it from a justice perspective. Talk about the need for intra-generational equity, right? That's sort of between people right now. Intergenerational equity, how are we providing equitable food systems for future generations? And interspecies equity and justice, right? This is not just a planet for humans, right? How are we actually taking that other nature component, or in some cultures where you can't separate humans from nature, how are we actually taking that into account? And so equity justice, this idea of redistributive justice, which is where we're actually looking at redistribution of the powers, the redistribution of power that takes a much more equitable distribution of not just the benefits, but also the risks across all scales of what kinds of shock impacts are going to be happening. So this could be through more equitable trade agreements, for example, and this needs to be both spatially just, but also temporally just. And we need to look at potential reparative sort of discourses, looking at the erosion of food systems that sort of happened through a colonial invasion of of many food systems of many lands around the world who no longer actually have access to their indigenous, to their local food systems through this complete erosion. Like, what kind of reparations do we actually need to be talking about here? Procedural justice, just transparent governance, monitoring and reporting on the social and environmental impacts, truthfully actually reporting and monitoring and not being scared to say things, accessible financial reporting, legal enforcement of transgressions, not just in sort of countries of domicile, but actually in the countries where these impacts are occurring. Then there's also recognitional and epistemic justice, and this is an acknowledgement to the value of multiple knowledge systems. It's not just science, it's not just Western notions of conceptualizations that we need to be recognizing here. So centering of the most vulnerable and meeting their needs is a priority before we actually start to maintain the power dynamics of that 1 to 4%, because that's not looking at an equitable future world that I think any of us want to be sort of working in. And that is my time up, and I look forward to discussing scaling actually with my colleague who's going to be coming forward, but I'll save that for my comment later.
Thank you so much. Amazing two speakers who have not only given us a lot to think about, but have done it on time. So very impressive presentation skills. I want to turn it over now to Dr. Gathungu, who's going to talk to us some more about seed production and scaling.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about seed innovations and scaling and how we can build resilience for smallholder farmers specifically. So a quick plug for where I work. I work for the Syngenta Foundation based in Nairobi, and we're all about climate smart and resilient agriculture and how we build, we increase the livelihoods, or we improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers through different elements, different interventions. And one of the key things that we do is to really make sure that farmers are getting the tools that they need, whether it's knowledge, inputs, and of course also that they're able to cope with climate change. And most importantly also that they're able to enjoy thriving markets for their outputs. That's a key focus for what we do today. And we cut across different areas within the globe, in Africa as well as in Asia. So what is climate smart and resilient agriculture? It's really looking at three broad areas around resilience. This is kind of where we are looking at increasing capacity of farming systems to deal with the shocks that we're talking about today, right? And that's kind of where we start looking at diversified farming systems, making sure that farmers are diversifying in their portfolios. We're also looking at soil health. It's a very important element that we can't ignore. Of course, are also building the capacity of smallholder farmers to know what to do, how to plant, how to produce, so increasing their knowledge capacity. And then looking at mitigation as well. This is kind of where we're starting to look at, we've supported farmers to adopt new technologies, but then we still have to look at the environment itself, right? How do we reduce the negative impact of the farming systems on the environment? Are we using more water? Are we taking nutrients from the soil? How are we putting it back? And finally, we also have to look at the productivity of the farmers themselves because of the gaps that we see in yields, right? So we want to make sure that we need to close those yield gaps so that we can increase their productivity and, of course, increase their income. So what we see here is four main climate-related challenges that are really inhibiting the productivity of smallholder farmers. And that's kind of where we start seeing elements about drought. I think this is something that we're seeing. We're talking about this. We spoke about that yesterday. And evidence is showing that nearly all farming systems are being affected by drought today, right? And I'm giving the context of smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan African context. Of course, it also is happening across the globe. Heat, increased prevalence of high heat that's stressing cropping systems. And then unpredictability of the seasons themselves today. I mean, I come from East Africa in Kenya, and the last year and a half has been quite erratic, and meaning that, farmers don't know when to plant because they don't know how much, rainfall is going to come in. And the last one is really around just that, rain. Too much rain, which means flooding. And then evidence is showing that 2/3 of our farming systems are confronted by floods as well. So it's a combination of all these factors. It depends on it's a mix. So some are getting more heat, more rain, others are getting drought, less erratic rainfall. So it's a combination of a lot of things. So how do we solve for that? And that's kind of where we're saying that there's a huge need to start looking at accelerating innovations, right? And it's innovations across a number of different elements. Where I sit, I lead the elements of seeds at the foundation. And that's kind of where we start looking at how we can tackle issues around what I just mentioned, drought, heat, flooding, among others, by looking at catalyzing availability of what we call climate-smart genetics. These are genetics or varieties that are able to cope with all the elements of climate change that I just talked about. But we also can't ignore the elements of also seed-applied technologies. These are technologies that are applied on the seed or on the crop itself to improve the nutrients uptake, the vigor of the crops, which means that crops are able to get up to speed before the climate changes as well. But we can't also ignore the elements about soil fertility management, right? I talked about soil health. So this is kind of where we want to bring in innovative soil diagnostic tools that are affordable to farmers so that they're able to then identify the nutrient needs for their farmings. And then also looking at how farmers can diversify. We don't want farmers to just grow the same crop over and over and over again, because then that makes it very difficult for them to get the output that they need from the soil itself. So this is kind of where we're starting to introduce new value chains that they can use for crop rotations. And these are crop value chains that we call mostly marginalized, right? We see farmers specific in sub-Saharan Africa. Where I come from, it's all about maize. But how can we catalyze the other value chains as well to help them diversify their portfolios? And then the last one is really around something that we talked about yesterday in the plenary, which was around resilience financial services. And that's kind of where we start looking at bundled solutions, because we really want farmers to de-risk their investments, because the smaller farmer dynamics is very challenging. So how do we de-risk their investments through innovative insurance facilities, and how do we get them also to be able to get credit so that they can actually buy some of these improved technologies that we're talking about. So, the World Bank, paints a quite gloomy picture, telling us that, we're going to need about 70% more food. We need to produce about 70% more food by 2050. And that's a bleak number. And how are we going to be able to do that? We're not going to be able to do that with the current technologies that we have today, because we just don't know what the climate change issues are going to throw at us, right? So the key thing here is, are we going to be looking at the small little maize cob? That's not going to cut it for us, right? And that's an image of a CIMMYT researcher. And it's clear that when you start looking at some of these crop varieties that are more innovative, that are climate smart, at least it ensures that you're going to be able to get some decent yields, given the challenges that we're going to be facing. So it's going to be important for us to look at improved seed technologies, which is going to definitely increase our productivity and then enhance, obviously, our resilience to these climate shocks. But there are going to be challenges. It's not going to be easy, and we know that, right? I work in that space, and there's a lot of challenges that we see every day in terms of how we can be able to catalyze these technologies and make them available to small-scale farmers. And that's kind of where we start looking at how we can help the commercial delivery of publicly bred varieties. There's a lot of investments going into the CGIAR systems, the National Agriculture Research Systems for each country, to help them, bridge that gap between them breeding varieties and making them to the market, because that gets very clear from the private sector perspective. But let's look at it the way it is. I mean, there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of good varieties, but they just don't make it to the market. So how do we catalyze that element? Also looking at how we can advocate for governments to liberalize the seed markets so that we can make them competitive, and the private sector can also invest in some of these technologies. Also looking at what we call product profiles. Product profiles are what we call the best case scenario. So we look at a profile of a specific crop and make sure that whatever is coming in from the breeding pipelines has a specific need downstream, whether it's on climate smartness or it's about the actual need in the market. So if I'm talking about maybe like soybean, for example, if the market wants more oil content or more protein, those profiles have to be integrated into the breeding pipelines. And of course also seed companies themselves. That's the avenue for the seed to get to the market. So how do we build a capacity and increase their appetite to invest in some of these more better technologies, and also looking at what we call foundation seed. This is the seed class that's at the beginning of the breeding process. How do we make sure that we have enough production of that so that downstream you can get more certified seed production, and also most importantly around the regulatory environment, the policy. Some of the policies are just not fit for purpose, and they're more detracting than accommodating. So we need to make sure that we're playing an advocacy role to make sure that there's a clear path for technologies to make it to market, right? So it's a call to action. We can't do it alone, so we always work with like-minded partners. Glad that we have AGRA in the house as well. We work together with them, and also to make sure that we're building resilience for ourselves, for farmers as well, and we can't ignore technology. This is what's going to be needed for us to get to the next level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Some really powerful conversations about the changing nature of agricultural demand, and also the importance of looking at both the aching points, I love that expression, and the transformational pathways as we think about ag production, and then some really deep dives into seed technology. I want to open it up to the floor for some brief Q&A for these three speakers, and then we will go to our next group of panelists. So I think we have somebody with a microphone who can, if you want to raise your hand and introduce yourself and your organization, and yeah, we've got some hands raised. And let's take 2 questions at a time.
Thank you very much. I'm Charles Tanui. I represent the African Research and Impact Network, and I know somebody's smiling there. She has been one of our mentors also, especially on transformation and sustainability under the STEP Center work. My first question goes to first presenter. That is looking at the CAADP, the progress towards commitments, yes. Under the CAADP targets, East Africa is not really performing under the third biannual review. It showed East Africa is third in terms of meeting the 7 commitments. But Rwanda and Tanzania, they are overally, of course, Rwanda was the called award winner. Now, when you look at the region, especially the priority that Africa is putting on adaptation in the agricultural context, what are some of the policy issues or political issues or research questions that are really impeding the region not to make that commitment, especially investing 10% of the national budget on agriculture? And then my second question goes to Tony from Syngenta Foundation. Recently, there was debate around the seed policy in Kenya, and I'm talking as a farmer also. I grew up in farming and I practice farming even when I continued with my research work. And I had a very bad incident when the male lateral necrosis really affected my plot. What is the support from Syngenta and maybe strategic institutions towards supporting seed bulking at the household level? Because what I notice is that I buy seeds and then within a very short time, I lose it again, maybe to pests, or maybe especially the indigenous seeds, it's very difficult to store them for quite a while to meet the next rain season. Thank you.
That was two questions in one there. Very efficient, and one more. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Richard Tu. I'm from Mozambique. It was a pleasure, and I think I learned a lot from the 3 speakers. And a lot of food for thought. I got my first question to my colleague from Syngenta, Tony. We just completed a study in Mozambique which shows that the small-scale farmers during the COVID were less impacted by COVID compared to big the companies that depend heavily on the international markets for their functioning. Meaning also, even the middle farmers and the big farmers that depends heavily on companies like Syngenta did perform very badly during the COVID era. So we are questioning whether big companies like Syngenta are good for building resilience. Did you get it?
Thank you. And we have one more. I'm going to have Luca, go ahead. And then we'll turn it back to the panelists because we want to hear from our other three speakers. We'll get the answers and then we'll turn to our next
Thank
group.
you. I have a question for Dr. Badian. I think that his presentation about the changes in the value chain, from a short traditional value chain to longer value chain with all the added value of transformation, I think is fascinating. My question, because I work essentially on food crisis, fragile context. So my question to you is how much you think that this new thinking is applicable, or what needs to be do to be applicable in the most difficult context that we know: conflict affected, fragile environment, poor people value chain where the added value is not that evident, and coming back to the preparedness plan that you mentioned, how do you see this in context where crises are become the new normal? No, it's not something that happens once in a while. Thank you.
So we have two for you, Dr. Badian. You want to go first?
Thank you very much. It's on. Yeah. All right. So on the BR and in CAADP in general, there is evidence that countries that have been serious about the agenda, embracing it, and implementing it fully have done much better than the others. There is really hard evidence on that. East Africa has been slower on that than, for example, West Africa, in just wholeheartedly embracing the whole thing, meaning that's really going through all the principles, all the components, all the steps, and realigning domestic policy design and programming around that. So that's one thing. And second, often I make a distinction. It may be perhaps theoretical, but I think it's real. The biennial review is evaluating African countries against ambitions. It is not tracking necessarily progress on the ground. So you look at most countries, they have made much better progress than the BR results would show. It's just because they jump from big to big. The jumps are just too big from one round to the next. And I think it may have been a little bit of design flaw in the results framework. Nevertheless, it's always good to have that ambition there, so to pull people. Now, on the 10%, for example, if you look at the mid-90s to the late 2010s, African countries have doubled the annual outlays for agriculture. They've doubled, literally, how much they spend every year. I don't want to say too loud now because the last 3 years or so, it has started to flatten for the first time over 20 years. But it did quite a lot of efforts for agriculture. What happened is that before they got into this 20 of recovery, they have not invested in agriculture, not in health, not in infrastructure, not in social services, no nothing. So they invested quite a lot across those different sectors. That's why the 10% wasn't reached, right? But still, at 4% quantitative average, there's no excuse. There's so much more they can do, even though they have doubled annual outlays over the 20 years. And more importantly, the ratio of expenditure to agricultural GDP, meaning just the value created by agriculture, is small and flat. There's no excuse to not return money into agriculture. Morocco does it well with 15% when they're doing the Plan Maroc Vert or the Green Morocco plan. So most other countries are around the 5 single digits. So there's a lot of room there, and I think they're going to be pushing quite a lot on that in the post-Malabo agenda. So on the transforming value chains, of course, every policy advice has to be context specific. You may have those general trends, but the specificities Yet, even in most of those countries, where the value chains are going, because again, even if you're in a conflict fragile context, you are not cut off from your neighbors. So the regional markets are one market. All right, so therefore your safer spaces, maybe your bigger towns or wherever, they'll have the same supermarket issues, the same shops around gas stations, all into the rural towns. So if you want your farmers to tap into that demand for a higher income, you will have to keep that bridge in mind, right? You might still go a long way with working on the 30%. As I said, 70% is processed, 30 is non-processed. So you can focus on the 30% for future income or start migrating toward the 70% for future income. But it has to be context specific. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to address the question I think that you talked about related to seed policy, right? And so our seed policy work, it's cross-cutting, right? So we're looking at, just like what you're talking about, the CADA assessments. So we do a deeper dive. We start looking at countries' implementation of things like the regional harmonization protocols within Africa, for example. Can seed move from one country to another? Can it get registered from one country to the other? We start looking at elements of localized seed policies, for example, seed classes, right? I think you talked about seed bulking at the household level. That starts now getting into more like standard seed protocols, which are now lower generations from certified seed. We're starting to discuss that with different stakeholders, regulators in country. If you go to Tanzania, for example, you can go as low as what they call quality declared seed, which is still good seed, and it means it can actually get to the hands of small-scale farmers. In Kenya, for example, that's not allowed. So, which inhibits other farmers downstream from getting access to those, important genetics. So we're playing an advocacy role at all levels, where we see a bigger role in the regulator, bringing in and making sure that farmers are able to get access to those technologies. So that's actually something that's happening already.
And you had a question?
Yeah, so the gentleman, I didn't quite get the question. It wasn't very clear on this side. Could you repeat that, please?
Just provocative in the sense that, when small-scale farmers are not really very much dependent on international markets and fluctuation, eventually they are more resilient than being very dependent on big companies like Syngenta or Bayer, etc. Because those companies, when are facing any difficulties elsewhere, it impacts directly the companies and that depend on them.
Okay, so yeah, it is a provocative one. I think, they were typically called big ag, right? But I think if you look at the investments that these organizations are making in technology and ensuring that farmers are able to get access to what technologies they need, and the fact that those technologies actually work, the question is how can we make them affordable to the farmers, right? And that's kind of where we're starting to look at now some of these innovative solutions to help farmers de-risk their investments. It may be easy for us, for me and you, to buy a bag of seed that costs $5, but that's out of reach for a lot of farmers. So how do we then catalyze? Because there's partners that are out there to help, support farmers to invest in those technologies. So it's not, in my view, a lot of work is being done already. And I think it's how we catalyze partnerships to help farmers get access to those technologies, in my view.
Thank you. Thanks for the provocative questions, for all of the hard questions. We're going to move on to our next set of panelists, and I'm going to just introduce the three of them up front, and then I'll invite them each in turn to the podium. We are going to start with Dr. Tavadswa Mabudi, Research Group Leader for Sustainable and Resilient Food Production Systems at the International Water Management Institute. He's going to be talking about the role of water in agriculture as it pertains to building resilient food systems. We're then going to turn to Dr. Namkulu Chovich, Director General's representative in Ethiopia with the International Livestock Research Institute. She is going to help us understand the evidence related to the importance of livestock and how to build the resilience of livestock within the food system. And then we are going to finally, in turn, speak with and hear from Dr. Tilahun Amade, Head of Research, Climate and Soil Fertility with AGRA. He's going to be talking about AGRA's policy work and what a resilient farmer looks like. So I would like to invite Dr. Mabodi to the podium now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and afternoon to everyone. I do not have a set of slides today. I thought I would just speak to the audience. So thinking about water in agriculture and under climate change, it's quite an intriguing conversation, especially from where we are located in sub-Saharan Africa, because of the significance of water risks to agriculture, especially under climate change. We know for a fact that about 95% of agriculture in the region is rain-fed, and we know for a fact that climate change, in terms of either decreasing rainfall amounts or increasing variability and extremes, and also the seasonal variations and variability that my colleague was talking about, is making it more challenging for farmers under rain-fed systems to be able to just cope, adapt, and transform their systems. We also know that the lack of access to improved varieties and seeds that fit within these changing environments, and the lack of advisory services to be able to inform them on the appropriate choice of variety for the right season is lacking. So often they are not being able to plant the right varieties, whether it is long-term or early maturing varieties. So it's making it increasingly difficult, and it's increasing the risk under rain-fed systems. We also know that because of these risks, from the CAADP document coming down to the regional agricultural plans, a key adaptation strategy is increasing the area under irrigation, expanding irrigation in agriculture. But we also know that expanding area under irrigation means increasing the demand for water that is going into agriculture. And for a fact, we know that agriculture already accounts for 70% of freshwater withdrawals. We cannot afford to keep increasing the allocation of water to agriculture. We need to be working towards reducing the allocation of water to agriculture so that we release water to other sectors: urbanization, industrialization, energy requirements, and environmental flows. So how do we manage increasing food production, building the resilience, increasing irrigation area, whilst at the same time reducing the water demand to agriculture? We know that irrigation technologies are evolving and improving in terms of increasing water use efficiencies, increasing water productivity. At IMI, we have done a lot of work around smart water technologies, where we are piloting different types of technologies. We are doing work on solar irrigation. We're doing water on variable rate irrigation using remote sense-based technologies, drone applications, all of that to improve water use efficiency. But that is happening at a field level. And the big question is, when farmers improve their water use efficiency, what do they do with the saved water? Do they release the saved water back into the environment so that there is more water available downstream? Or do they open up more land for irrigation because now they've got extra water? That's the big question. So in many cases, those improvements in efficiencies and the water that is saved from that is not being transferred back into the environment to increase environmental flows. It's going back into agriculture and supporting expansion of agriculture, which then means that ultimately the improvements or the reduction in water withdrawals that we want to see are not being realized. Now, this doesn't help the case for de-risking agriculture, because it's just increasing the risk, because now you've got a bigger area of land that you're irrigating. There are also energy implications, because much of Africa is energy constrained. We are dealing with load shedding in South Africa, and much of the region has been dealing with it for several years. And the major challenge to irrigation is pumping and distributing water and the energy cost to it. I've worked with a lot of irrigation schemes where the requests, and I was reading recently about the Makatini irrigation scheme in Jozini, which is struggling, and the request that has come is from the farmers is, can government bail them out by clearing the ESCOM bill so that it becomes viable. Now, is it sustainable for government to provide energy subsidies to agriculture so that farmers can farm and irrigate? We've got good lessons from India in terms of what happened when they provided energy subsidies through promoting and subsidizing solar-based irrigation. It led to over-abstraction of groundwater. It created huge problems in terms of soil salinity, and they're now having to deal with that. So energy subsidies on their own are not efficient or are not effective. So what we're trying to lead towards is that building resilience in agriculture is more complex than it is, perhaps communicated. Laura touched on the issue of, systems thinking and transformation and the complexity of systems. And she also dealt with the interconnectedness of systems. And when you understand the interconnectedness of systems, it comes into the space of trade-offs. And that's what I've been trying to highlight in the examples that I've been giving, that for every decision that we make in agriculture, there are implications that happen and are felt outside of agriculture. And a lot of good decisions that could be made within agriculture could have serious negative implications outside of agriculture. So we need to be able to better understand these trade-offs, and they occur at different scales. So you've heard people talking about multiple scales. We need to understand these trade-offs at multiple scales. I gave the example that improving efficiency at a field level does not necessarily create more water at the basin or catchment level, because that saved water might be consumed at the field level. So at the system level, you are still creating trade-offs, because if a farmer is going to expand area under cultivation, you are having land use change. You are going to be generating less runoff. So, consequently, you are impacting on your environmental flows. If they are going to expand area under irrigation, it also means they are going to increase the demand for energy to pump and distribute that irrigation, because they've got extra water that they've saved up. You are increasing energy demand on the other side. So at a system level, you are creating trade-offs from what was a good decision at a field or farm level. So how do we manage those interdependencies across water, environment, energy, and food systems at different scales? And what we have been talking about of late is what we call the water, energy, food ecosystems nexus. And basically, the water, energy, food ecosystems nexus, or WEFI nexus, is an approach that seeks to understand these trade-offs and synergies at different scales, seeks to quantify those synergies and trade-offs and to better identify them. It also speaks to transforming the nature of partnerships, because a major part of how these trade-offs arise is because of incoherence between different sectors, lack of coordination, collaboration across sectors, where decisions are not being made collaboratively. So what we are working towards is a system of restructuring partnerships. So there are different dimensions to the WEF. There is the conceptual understanding, which is just understanding what are trade-offs. There is the analytical part, which is being able to identify and quantify them. And there's the discourse level, which is where we are now able to take those understandings into policy and discussions and partnerships to say, how do we work together more effectively to bring about transformation, not only in the food system, but in water, environment, energy, and other interlinked systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Complexity, trade-off, and transforming partnerships. Wow, a lot to unpack there. I'm going to invite Dr. Chovich to the podium now.
I'm a short one, so good afternoon, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be able to say something today. I will be looking at how livestock fits into the broader perspective of looking at how, on the role of agriculture for resilience. And to start with, Dr. Badian made my day. As somebody whose career is rooted in nutrition, it was quite a pleasure to hear an economist of his stature using nutrition as an outcome for actually looking at how our food systems are looking. And I want to build on that. If you think in terms of what is it that we could use as a measure of whether our food systems are actually delivering on what they should be, we call them food systems. So they should be delivering food to the plates. But what they should be delivering is healthy, nutritious diets onto our plates, but do so sustainably. And livestock then plays a role within that mix. It should be part of a mixed crop livestock system where the livestock can contribute to that greater amount of nutrition, but it has to do that sustainably, and that's where our challenges are. And they are many. First of all, across the continent, the productivity of the livestock that we have is extremely low. And so we need improvements in genetics, we need improvements in feeds and forages, we need improvements in production practices to be able to actually get to that outcome. Currently, when we look, I'm going to use Ethiopia as an example, where we've seen increases from some of the work in our local breeds, where there's been improvements from average milk productivity levels of as low as 1.5 liters per day to 2 liters per day. That's a 33% increase. And yet when we look at some of the hybrid varieties where you've brought in genetic material from elsewhere, this can go up to 16, 18 liters per day. And there are some farmers in the same countries that can even reach 35, 40 liters per day. What does that have to do with resilience? In a cow that is producing 1.5 liters of milk per day, the greenhouse gas intensities, emission intensities, are that much greater. So essentially, you will produce more greenhouse gas emissions per glass of milk. So for us to start even thinking about how are we going to increase resilience from that perspective, that productivity level needs to change. So this is an area where we have some examples where we've shown increases in genetics as well as production practices, as well as feeds and forages. The next place is the issue of the climate risks that we face, and there are plenty. A lot of the livestock producing areas of Africa in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa are really in drought-stricken areas. So these are areas that, in some cases, crop agriculture is not even an option. So your food security resilience actually comes from them keeping that livestock that is then used as a livelihood to be able to obtain the cereal foods that they require, medical attention, and what have you. So resilience in those areas means something different. How do we look at climate mitigation? How do we make accurate forecasts, but not just forecasts, actually act on those forecasts in terms of early warnings and services? Somebody once said to me, an early warning is not an early warning if there is no early action. Because what use was it? And here, our climate scientists then are working with national governments to try and look at how best to get the farmers to respond to those climate calamities. A colleague of mine yesterday, I think, presented on the index-based livestock insurance that has been implemented in Kenya and Ethiopia. It has been more effective in Kenya, where these 5 consecutive seasons of drought that have been, we are now being told the effect, the impact would have been much greater if this index-based livestock insurance was actually not in place. How does it work? It works with climate scientists that look at the canopy and predict that there's not going to be enough vegetation for so many livestock to be able to survive. And that kicks in an insurance program that includes the private sector insurance companies. Governments invest in those insurance products, and what happens is there are triggers when there is this amount of vegetation. The farmers then can sell their livestock and protect those losses from taking place. Then they can restock at a better time. What else can we do in such settings? Those are the challenges that we need to look at in terms of, as we move forward, how do we begin to integrate livestock and crop production in such a way that we can address some of the resilience challenges that we face. I would like to give an example also on the poultry side. On the poultry side in Ethiopia, when our scientists started looking at genetic improvements, they talked to communities. There's been a lot today about talking to communities and hearing what their needs were. While the scientists would have thought about broiler chickens and layers separate, the farmers actually wanted dual-purpose breeds. And so the International Livestock Research Institute has got a program where they are breeding dual-purpose chickens, where egg production is improved, and in addition to that, growth is improved as well. That serves the purpose for the smallholder farmers much better. The types of improvements that have been accrued here are things like 123% increase in egg production, 95% improvement in growth or meat production. What is the overall story here? If we are going to improve resilience in mixed farming crop livestock systems, we need to look at how we integrate the two. A lot of the agroecological agricultural practices that we hear about, a lot of the regenerative agricultural practices actually require livestock to be part of that integrated system. So what we need to do, what we often see now is the crop residues are used for feeding livestock. But how much of those crop residues do we remove? How much must we leave behind so that carbon sequestration can still be maintained? And then within there, we are also integrating forage legumes as part of the mix, and those then address issues of soil health. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is the situation is complex, but we need to look at solutions that actually leverages that complexity to get us to a better place. The food systems are not going to get any simpler, but we need to think in terms of that complexity and actually come up with solutions that can actually help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot to take in there. That issue of complexity, that theme keeps coming back at us, as well as this integration between different systems, and in your case, talking about animals and crop production and emissions and adaptation, mitigation adaptation all at once. So thank you. We're going to turn now and talk about soil health. Dr. Amade.
Yeah, good afternoon. I hope you have still energy to listen to me. My presentation will try to bring the pieces together and display what does it mean to the farmer. In Agra, when we talk about resilience in a narrow agricultural sense, is a farmer in good years produces a very good yield, at least 2.53 tons per hectare. When a shock comes, the reduction will be 10-20%, and yet it will be beyond the survival line, has enough produce to store and have enough money in the bank to bypass, to at least, not to suffer by the short-term immediate shocks. While a farmer who is not getting the services, the seeds, the water management, the extension, in normal years is producing very low, and in bad years it's getting even worse. So, to bounce back for that type of farmer is always a challenge. So how do we do that is really what we are trying to do in Agra. In Agra, we are trying to bring the pieces together. One is really how to make sure that we support farmers to have access to input and output markets. How do we make sure that they have context-specific technology and practice that farmers can adopt and responding to their demands, but also making sure that we have the genetic potential at hand, those are seeds, the appropriate climate resilient seeds. And all that should be supported by policy and incentives, enabling environment that supports some of these interventions. And, when you talk about Africa, Africa is not a country, it's a continent. It's very diverse. We have written a book 2-3 years ago identifying about 13 distinct African farming systems. And each farming system has a very different type of demand, be it coming from the market opportunities, the weather, the linkage, the policy, the type of options farmers have. All that, has to be context specific and respond to the immediate demands of the communities, but also the perspectives and the capacity of the respective countries. And we published, I think 2 months ago, a paper in the journal Sustainability. What does it mean to address some of these challenges in Africa? There are so many narratives out there, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, sustainable intensification. All of these are coming mainly from input-intensive systems in the north. And when you cascade down to Africa, what does it mean? For example, what does it mean if you say farmers don't use fertilizers? When the farmers are not using fertilizers now, they have probably the maximum they use in Africa, the average is 18 kilogram per hectare, while the crop demand, the 3-ton maize, requires at least 65 kilogram nitrogen per hectare. So there's a lot of mining going on. And how do you make that system resilient and sustainable unless you bring in the critical inputs? We have identified about 8 major conditions, drivers, that could bring about sustainability in the continent. Yield and productivity, nutritious food is probably criteria and driver number one. Soil health, carbon pools, access to inputs, restoration of landscapes, improving water productivity and access to water. Energy, rural energy. You know, if you see what's happening in the villages, 80% of the biomass is going to fire to cook food. And what do you recycle? How do you manage the soil? You know, talk about regeneration. There's nothing in the system because of the intense competition for resources. But then adaptation, talk about. These are all multiple goals that farmers are really seeking for. And how do you make sure that this global knowledge is cascaded down to the context of Africa? So what we're trying to do in AGRA is, first thing is really making sure that we create farmers' capacity to mishmash the available resources, the technologies, and make it work for their systems. So farmer innovation. The second thing is really, supporting the private sector so that farmers have access to inputs, have market access, have input access, but also are making money in the system. So really integrating private sector, particularly SMEs, into the agricultural environment. The third thing we're trying to do is really creating capacity for governments to respond to the challenges and create an enabling environment. All that leading to profitable and sustainable systems, if that functions. There are really things that should be done on the ground. And for all this, one of the major challenges is that farmers, they don't have access to technologies and knowledge. If you see the farmer to extension ratio in the continent, in some countries, 3,000 farmers are served by one extensionist. If you go to Mozambique, if you go to Burkina Faso, if you go to Mali. So how can we minimize, reduce farmer to extension ratio? And one strategy we developed, a model, is by using what we call village-based advisors. These are educated, sometimes retirees who are in the village with a bit of extension content support that could really support their farmers, their communities, to access knowledge, to access input, to also link them with the private sector and with critical, market chains. And they could be also making money in the process. And these have been tried. And in some countries, like, as I said, in Mozambique, in Burkina Faso, they have been institutionalized because the public extension sector is very weak to, deliver the expected, technology and practice to the farmers. And they also play multiple roles. They play in training, in demonstration, in advisory, in bringing access to inputs. And in most of the countries, when you compare, before and after, you see a significant change in terms of really access to technology and practices. And at the end of the day, in AGRA, we're saying, look, all this has to be implemented and has to bring about impact. And up to now, have been reaching about 26 million smallholder farmers, but also, bringing more money into the system, mobilized about $1.4 billion in terms of flagships by demonstrating showcases and business models. And in the process, created jobs, about 36,000 advisors we have now in the continent who are beyond and working closely with the national exchange systems, and multiple agro-leaders who are linking farmers with businesses, with inputs, but also with aggregators. And all that has to be converted into money at the end of the day. And the major really motto is in the whole process, strengthening the institutions, the local institutions, the government institutions, but also the environment that these institutions are operating from. And that is where, when these operations are capacitated, have the skills, have the manpower, have the guidelines, have the extension content, then they are the ones who are going to sustain and bring about resilience into the farms and the systems. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Amede. We now are going to turn it back to the audience. We had a nice summative discussion about what the resilient farmer looks like in Africa, and I can see there are lots of questions. So maybe we can start here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question, I think, which probably cuts across all the speakers. A couple of observations that I made, because we have had a lot of conversation about what's resilience, what's the ability to adapt to climate change, or the ability to adapt to conflicts, and there's a lot of discussion about needing to measure absorptive capacity, transformative capacity, to understand the mediators. And speaking across, listening across to the panel, it was very evident that in the ag space, in the agriculture space, we have a clearer sense of what's needed to build that capacity. So we talked about, you talked about processing, we talked about access to markets, access to finance, access to improved seeds. So I wanted to ask, like, for example, Dina, you asked, you want evidence whether, are resilience investments making a difference? And it seems like in the ag sector, it seems like we could get to that evidence faster. My question is for all of you working on improving food systems, how would you measure resilience? How would you want to see the evidence? Do you want to see evidence about, the system itself is resilient, or would you like to measure that by looking at farmer outcomes, whether farmer yields are stabilized, whether their incomes are stabilized? And I ask that for a reason, because we are supporting, I'm Tulika from Mathematica, we're supporting AGRA in thinking through the learning process and how would we assess resilience. And as we are looking to evaluate food systems, I'm also wondering whether it's really important to get to the entities that make up the food system, and will that resonate with all of you? Just to ask that question.
Great question, and I think there's right across the hall from you there's someone with a question.
Hi, my name is Precious Mwanga. I'm with World Vision US. Just curious, I've heard a lot of incentives that are being put out there in terms of promoting resilience. There's this term talking about the farmer bouncing back. So looking at some of the areas where we're working in a lot of fragile contexts, and they're talking about some of the drivers behind insecurity is conflict and COVID and all those things. So the past few days, I have never heard anybody talk about the importance of mental health when it comes to promoting resilience. So just a quick question, can any one of you talk about how we're prioritizing mental health, especially for the rural farmers in the resilience space? Number two, a week and a half ago, I was in France attending a global sorghum conference, and there was a lot of talk about how sorghum is one of the crops that is resistant to climate shocks, and also it is pest resistant. And there's also a lot of talk about how a lot of researchers are able to breed different varieties of sorghum based on certain contexts. So my question is, looking at all these things we talked about, there was a gentleman who talked about water, how much water is needed, and also coming from sub-Saharan Africa, we eat a lot of corn, and that requires a lot of pesticides and requires a lot of water. So what are your thoughts on shifting people's mindsets from totally relying on maize, that has been a staple, to probably shifting towards the sorghum space, which is proven to be drought resistant and pest resistant?
All right, we're going to start with the resilience measurement question first. We're looking at a systems level measurement, a farmer outcome measurement. What would you like to see? Maybe Dr. Ahmed, I'd like to start with you.
When we are trying to measure resilience from the agriculture, from the productivity side, in this continent, you see a lot of variability of rainfall over seasons and over years. When you see the total amount of rainfall, it is not changing much. What is changing is the distribution within a season. which is exposing farmers for risk because the water may not be available when the plant needs it, for example, at flowering time. So if you take 4, 5, 6 years of yield and there are changing rainfall pattern, you can very easily come up with a CV, a variability index that shows you that a farmer who has managed his farm better, had climate resilient seeds, had managed his farm in good agronomy, will have less variability index compared to a farmer who is not doing well. So that variability over time can be taught. But also then, preparedness of institutions to respond. So if you have, we see disasters, fire in the US, in their own economy, but you don't see that disaster coming and people suffer overnight to the level that we are suffering. So the capacity of the institutions to respond to is also another indicator that could be really considered. Thank you.
So an institutional capacity index and some sort of a farmer efficiency and productivity. Maybe just one more panelist who might want to speak about that, and then we'll go to the other questions so we have more time. Anybody else want to share an observation about how we want to measure resilience in the ag system? Dr. Badian?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this already when I was speaking, that there's a lot we can tell by what is on the plate. Normally, we start seeing people use coping strategies and they begin to reduce consumption of this and that and the other. That's usually a sign that there is trouble. It means whatever they would normally have fallen back on to provide on the plate is now faltering. So that's one way in which you can measure resilience. Because if they're still able to cope, there's that level of resilience included in their coping strategies. I think what is missing when you take that route only is how did the food actually get onto the plate? So that sustainability component needs to come into play as well. Because if they are showing resilience on their plates, but they are doing that by degrading things all around them, that then is not resilience, and that's an important aspect to consider.
So it's a sort of dietary diversity or numbers of food groups that people are consuming. Is that how you see it? Dr. Badian wanted to add to something.
Thank you very much. I don't want to make it complex, but you can't measure it before you get to a crisis, or you want to see after a crisis how resilient you were, right? And I'm just going to focus on the latter. And here it depends on what you want to protect, what you want to preserve, right? It's not just one thing. Are you preserving livelihoods, or is it just asset-based? Are you just looking at a household? You're looking at a community? Are you looking at the entire supply chain, right? Each one of those, at whichever level. The way to measure that for me is the scale and the speed of return to normalcy after a shock, right? If you can really go back, 80% of the people recover to 90% of where they were before the shocks, you're more resilient than in a case where, let's say, 50% recover maybe 60% after I don't know how many, much of time, right? So that allows you the flexibility to look at whatever you want to focus on and then know. And then after every shock, how can I be better positioned so that next time I can reach more that get back to normalcy in a much smaller period of time to get there. And then over time, you'll improve. Thank you.
Anybody want to tackle the mental health question?
Thank you. We have done studies where initially we mapped the incidence of depression and food security. And what we found from those studies was that there was a high incidence of depression where there was also a high incidence of food insecurity. Interestingly, we found high incidences of food insecurity within areas that are highly suitable for agriculture. And that was mostly because in those areas that are highly suitable for agriculture, the land is under commercial agricultural production. So the people who are actually living there have very low access to food. And then there's a high incidence of depression. We also found an association with disasters, that the incidence of disasters such as droughts and floods, again, was associated with food insecurity and hence mental health. So these are two studies that we've done. And I think it's a very important question, because typically, even when we talk about health, we talk about health from the nutrition perspective, malnutrition, and those sort of indicators. We have not really done much in terms of understanding the mental health aspect of it. Even in our own work, we've only gone as far as understanding the depression, the linkages to depression. But I think it's an important step towards including mental health as a part of the broader health aspect in terms of food systems. Thank you.
Dr. Gathungu, did you want to add?
No, that's okay.
Okay, all right.
I was going to just comment on that. Beyond mental health, so I think, thank you for raising health. Often when we talk about agriculture, we forget about health. We look at it as completely separate. And I just wanted to build on what he said, to say that it's not just mental health, it's health in general, and its relevance to agriculture. Most of us look at health as a long-term investment in your capacity for productivity. But there is evidence out there that having a health system that addresses the seasonal diseases that curtail labor availability during peak labor seasons have a much bigger impact on productivity today, on returns to inputs, to fertilizers, to seeds, to wherever it is, and technologies. So having a health system that delivers for the rural areas is not just a health issue, it is just a nutrition issue. It is a growth and income and productivity raising issues right now in the short run. And that is really important, where ministers of health and agriculture ought to be working together. Right now we look at money going to health as lost to agriculture, but it doesn't have to be. We can program it so that it is conducive to supporting better agricultural outcomes now, not just in the future. So depression is just part of that mental health. Thank you.
All right, I want to make sure that our panelists get a final reflection in on their top priority, but I'm going to take two more questions from the audience because there's just so many, and I'm sure the panelists would be happy to stay a little longer as we close to speak with some of you directly. So I'm going to let those with the microphones, make the call. Okay, there's a woman over here in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Wilma from University of Zambia. And thank you for all the lovely presentations. As a university academician, we train teachers, they go and teach. We train doctors, they go into hospitals. But we train agricultural scientists, and they don't go and farm. And my question to the panelists is, going forward, are we assured of a resilient future in terms of food systems? Because are there enough youths filling in the gaps? Because looking at like the country I come from, youths are not interested in agriculture. It's a lot of work. And my fear is we will have too many gaps in terms of people actually with their hands on the plows going forward. Is there anything we're doing to make agriculture attractive? Thank you.
Hi. My question is to Dr. Mabodi. First of all, apologies for disagreeing with you, if I may. You mentioned that water extractions from rivers and the energy costs are going to negatively impact the downstream users, while that is perfectly true. But that doesn't have to be the only way that we enable agricultural irrigation to be enabled on these farms. So I'll give you an example. So in 1980s, late 70s and early 80s, the state of Georgia in the US they started a very similar project where they had on-farm storages where the rainwater would get harvested. The government would provide money to the farmers to dig the ponds themselves, little ponds, and that would store just enough water for maybe 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters of water on their fields, small fields, and that makes a dramatic difference in the crop yields. So as a result, the irrigation went from, I don't have the exact statistics, but less than 100,000 hectares to about more than 1.6 million now, in a span of 15 years when the program was active. So, and there was a standard questions, same questions raised, the impact on downstream, energy, all of that, and none of that materialized. Because when it rains, especially under climate change, when the rainfall intensity is increasing, there are lots of studies that show that the rain intensity is growing, so nothing is staying, not much is staying as it used to. Well, that we can use it to our advantage to store in the on-farm storages and let the rest run, downstream, and still have a little bit of water left to irrigate that will allow farmers to irrigate with those. So my question to you is do you envision a system like this where we could go to World Bank or some deep pockets to enable this, ponds for work kind of structure, where in return they are getting a pond for themselves and a source of water for their irrigation, and then on the flip side, we are also resolving this irrigation and the chances of increased agriculture and sustainability, to go to the previous question, make the agricultural productivity such that it becomes profitable, attractive to generations to come. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to talk about youth and agriculture?
I could go on that one. That's quite an interesting point. I think the youth is definitely interested in agriculture. What they're not interested is in the agriculture of perhaps their parents, perhaps their grandparents, because that's more subsistence, it's low productivity, low yields, low income, so they don't want to do that. And I think the key thing is, how do we then catalyze value chains that might be of interest to them? In terms of where they can create value, there's some value adds in some of these crop value chains that they can get themselves into. How do we increase their appetite to become agri-entrepreneurs? And you heard from AGRA, they have this village-based advisors system. That's also an element of bringing in the youth into agriculture. We have our own initiatives called Farmer Hubs, where we identify village-based young people who have an entrepreneurial mindset. We give them training, we give them resources to start a business, and then they have a network of between 100 and 500 farmers under them, and they can consolidate inputs, they can consolidate services, soil health, mechanization, among others, and the retention rate is over 90%, and that builds their entrepreneurial mindset. And of course now their friends see that and they want to engage into that, so then we're getting them more involved in agriculture. And of course also we're bringing in a lot of students from the academic institutions as interns that are then looking to get into agricultural space, so we're doing that quite a bit.
Dr. Mabudi, maybe you can address both that question and the other.
Okay, so we actually just finished last year an exercise to develop a youth empowerment strategy for agriculture and rural development for South Africa. And we came up with several pillars. I think the first thing that we realized in that was, when you look at it as agriculture, you take a narrow perspective, because it always almost ends up being very productionist and at the entry level, and governments find it easier to also invest there, because it's easy to say we've bought seeds, we've done this, but if you look at it from a food system perspective, then you understand that agriculture is just a component of the broader food system. And within the food system, there are various other subsystems where young people can come in and operate, which are very supportive to the agriculture itself. So you look now, we are talking 4IR. You can have young people providing, we're training young people to use drones and things like that, so that they can provide agri-advisory services. Techno-savvy things. Again, there's issues of capacity development that need to be done, because there's serious gaps in terms of capacity, which also then narrow people's perspective to what agriculture is and what the food system is. There's lack of awareness generally in terms of what are the opportunities, what is the opportunity space, who do I engage with, and there's a lack of dynamism in terms of policymakers in understanding that young people are dynamic. They are not a heterogeneous group as well. So you need to have differentiated and very targeted products that target different youth groups in different geographies and across different areas of the food system. So we came up with about 8 different pillars of possible interventions that should be considered. Hopefully that document will be published soon this year. And then the second question was from the gentleman at the back. We are not in disagreement, we're actually in agreement. The point that I was making was that people need to have those considerations in place, because a simplistic or linear perspective does not always add up linearly. It does not always add up that if we increase access to water and irrigation, then people are going to irrigate more and yields increase, people make more money, and because people will make decisions differently. And I was just trying to highlight that case that farmers could make decisions differently if they've got water savings. And there's a need for regulation to say what then happens when farmers have made those savings. What do they do with it? It should not be an assumption that they are going to just use what they already had and let the other water run off. So we should have proper regulation. There are examples abound. The US has some good regulation, regulatory mechanisms. There are also water markets that are being practiced in certain areas where cities and other authorities are actually subsidizing farmers and incentivizing them not to then expand the area under irrigation and release water, especially for downstream cities that are growing and expanding. There's also integrated storage and basin management, which is being practiced. There's managed aquifer recharge, which is being practiced, and all of these are things that can be deployed. But again, they need to be deployed within an understanding of the system and the landscape within which you're doing it, so that it increases positive spin-offs and you reduce the negative implications. Thank you.
Thank you. We are down to our last 7 minutes, and I was going to give each speaker 3 minutes to give us their final thoughts. We're down to about, I think, a minute each. And just turning back to each one of you as we close, really a diverse and essential set of viewpoints here, a chance for you to share your final words of wisdom. I know we will not have time to pull all of these different threads together, nor do I know if it would be even possible, given the amazing depth and breadth of experience and insights and information that you've shared. But if you could pull out one final key message to this audience in terms of your recommendation for the most essential element of the thing you would want to see move the needle most on, what is the most important recommendation or area of exploration that you think we need to pursue? And I'll start with Dr. Amadei.
Yeah, thank you very much. 2 things I would like to say. One, we cannot separate resilience from food security, livelihoods, and poverty. Unless we address poverty, there will be a continuation of mining of resources, deforestation, land degradation, nutrient mining, drying of rivers. All this will come, and we cannot stop it, and it will be only a preaching unless really poverty and food security is addressed. The second thing I would like to emphasize is that, resilience must be a more deliberate and a major area of focus. So we cannot really talk about resilience as a side product unless we plan and integrate it into our investments, in our works and engagements and financing. The chance to really achieve resilience will be very, very low. Thank you.
Dr. Chovich?
Yes, I would like to finish off by saying our planet is in trouble. And so the resilience that we are talking about has to be all-encompassing. We need to, as we think of resilience solutions, these need to be in the context of the climate challenges that we are facing now, and also where the climate is going, because we can be thinking of adapting today's climate, but tomorrow's climate is different. And therefore, there's a lot of work that we need to do in preparation of that tomorrow that is to come. And then I want to finish off with the question of youth. Within that broader context of where we're going to get the food of tomorrow would be the youth. And I think it is a crisis. I don't think the issue of no youth coming into agriculture is isolated to the African continent. It is a global crisis that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Dr. Mabadi?
Thank you. I just have 3 points to make in terms of how do you address complexity. The first one is we need to enable governance and institutions and improve, within that context, we need to improve coordination, collaboration, and co-implementation. That means we need to address issues of policy coherence across sectors. We need to enable and transform the nature and networks of partnerships within the food systems so that we all work together and pull in the same direction. And we need to create the necessary platforms to allow for greater convergence so that we really enhance that sustainability aspect. The second point that I would want to make is we also need to enable transitions and transformations. So we talk a lot about transformation and we talk a lot about transitions, but we need to create the enabling space that supports transitions and transformations. And then all of this has to be done within the context of understanding social justice issues, which my colleague has mentioned earlier, around inclusion, poverty, inequality, and the history of certain places. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can all agree that we definitely need agriculture to increase resilience, right? But then we also know that agriculture can cause issues if we don't manage all the elements that we talked about today correctly. Issues around how we can regenerative agriculture, among other things, to build our resilience. But we can't do that alone. There's a lot of us in this space that are doing different elements of work, whether it's policy, whether it's gender involvement, whether it's farmer awareness, whether it's technology advancement. We all have to come and have a coherent approach in how we do this collectively and not try to do this alone. We all have to do this in partnerships to make sure that we're all bringing everybody to the table so that we're all collectively supporting resilience through agriculture. Thanks.
I might also just take the liberty of answering the question on sorghum that wasn't actually responded to, if I may. I'm concerned. I'm worried. If we all close our eyes and imagine what agricultural systems on the continent would look like in 2050 if we actually followed our current trajectory, I'm concerned that we might actually be seeing either the Midwest of the US as an ending point, despite acknowledging the contextual diversity of the continent. Potentially the Punjab, if we look at the kind of really extractivist kind of agricultural production that is the 70% increase that we might need if we keep current numbers, but not if we address waste and other kinds of consumption practices, but we can talk through that. So my input is how much have we actually learned from history? And so I'm not going to go into a debate on general resilience versus specific resilience, resilience of what to what. I see you, but I'm going to answer the questions, so I'm going to take a little bit more time because I haven't actually answered any questions. And instead of talking about resilience, I'm going to refer to the intervention that I think that the gentleman made from the Mozambican context, which is a really critical point, actually, on how small-scale how the larger farmers that were dependent on seed were much more vulnerable under COVID than small-scale farmers. And I think we need to listen to that evidence of what resilient actually means under times of crisis, and how we can actually learn from that experience and that kind of resilience. And so I think we all agree on the panel that there aren't any silver bullets. We know they don't work. There's not going to be like one surefire way of solving the problem. And so whilst technology and innovation is really critically important, it's going to be a foundation of us moving forward. I'm wondering whether we're actually creating more dependence rather than resilience when we kind of see that as the main framing. And so I want to come to sorghum, because I've written on this in the South African context. And it's a fascinating story of how an increase in research and development from seed corporations, largely around maize, actually drove that competitiveness in South Africa. Plus tax exemption that came in on maize completely outcompeted the sorghum market in South Africa. And so that coupled with an apartheid agenda of the drunk uncle, right? Sorghum being this traditional food that went into making mbote, etc. Sort of had this colonial erasure of making it a famine food, resulted in the fact that actually right now some of our biggest corporations rely on buying sorghum from the Americas that are actually meant for feed in order to actually satisfy some of the local markets. But there's been a reinvigoration. And I think that this is where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, is that this reconfiguration around understanding our local context, on recognizing our diverse knowledge systems, and actually thinking through, well, what is the power of sorghum? Yes, it's resilient to climate. Yes, it has these other nutritional, etc. benefits. But it's also something that Gogol understands, right? That our grandmothers understand, that are in our stories, that are in our rituals, in our practices, that food is not just calories, food is culture, food is place, food is connection. And I think we lose that quite often when we just focus on metrics of productivity, on like how much can we get out of this land, etc. And so I think that's how we get youth also interested, is if we bring that connection back, if we really reinvigorate our food systems into something that's rich, that's full, that's not sort of free of things. And so, yeah, this idea of gastronomic landscapes has been an interesting one that we've been playing with, and I'm happy to talk through more on that.
Thank you. I was first start by saying that for the first time in history, we have had 2 decades of strong economic performance. We never had anything like that, and broad-based across the continent. I'm saying this to say that there's a lot of things that might have gone right in so many different places. So we have a laboratory to go back and learn. Every country, what went right in whatever problem we're trying to solve, we can learn from. We have a whole program at Academia 2063 called the Malabo Montpellier Panel, from energy to irrigation to mechanization to trade to livestock to climate finance to bioeconomy. We develop a methodology, we rank African countries, we go to the top 5 or 6 and look at what did they do to be on the top of the African, and you'll be surprised. There's really a lot of things happening there, first. Second, we haven't spoken very much about technology, but it's really going to be, just like it has been in the history of humanity, it's going to be such a big part of having productive and resilient economies in Africa. I think we have to invest in transgenics. We have to invest in gene editing and biotechnology. I know it's taboo in Africa. There's no way we're going to deal with the things you had here. You remember your steps? Sustainable farming. It is transgenic. It is technology that's going to bump you up there. Whether it's droughts, whether it's flood, whether it's salinity, whatever it is, we have to come with a better technology. We often shy away from it because we talk about dependence and other things, but look, we're all using iPhone and Samsung. And Samsung and Apple are among the wealthiest corporations in the world. we're making them richer when it comes to us for productivity. And farmers want to use Monsanto seed or somebody else's seed, it's a taboo because they're going to make Monsanto more richer. Well, apple is rich, something is rich. I think it's at the end of the day, what do we get out of the system? We have to embrace technology much better as nations, as countries. And embracing it doesn't mean to be passive and take it from somebody else. It means investing in the laboratories and the expertise to master the technology. Currently, we're very passive. Others develop, we take or we don't take. That's not the way for a winning strategy in the future. And finally, we have to invest in preparedness and response capacity. Shocks are going to be part of everyday life in the future. The earlier we do it, the more comprehensive we are, the better we will ensure resilience in our communities. Thank you.
Well, let's give them a big round of applause. Clearly an amazing and diverse range of perspectives. I know we could spend hours, and I am going to ask the panelists to stay behind because there's a lot of folks here who seem eager to speak with you. But just this, this demand for sustainability and productivity, the importance of global solutions from harnessing the best of technology, but giving people a choice, and the sense of culture and place and contextualized responses having to stay really central. I've really felt both the complexity, the importance of partnerships, still tensions, but I think everybody, it's these kinds of conversations that we really need to have to advance this agenda, so I thank all of you.